Does the female gaze exist? So before we answer that, let's talk about where the idea comes from, sort of the framing it against the male gaze. So the male gaze starts with John Berger, who is a theoretician who wrote a very famous book called The Ways of Seeing. It was published in 1972, and he talks in that book a lot about how visual culture has impacted society, but also how society has impacted visual culture. And as part of that, he comes up with this idea of the gaze. And in it, he talks about how women are depicted as passive throughout art. And we're going to get back to that in a moment. So then, a few years later, film scholar Laura Mulvey coins this really important phrase, the male gaze. And in it, she adds the word male for a really important reason, because it's not just that women are passive, it's that men construct women as passive. And so that there is actually an agent creating these passive images of women. And her assessment of that has been then, since the 1970s and 75 when it was published, that basically that theory of the male gaze has gone beyond film studies and is often used about art history and about visual culture of all kinds, media studies, all of these things, where there is this conception that patriarchy has impacted how women are depicted. And now, before we talk about that, I think it is important that we really quickly talk about patriarchy. I think a lot of, particularly men, hear this and they hear, oh, you mean men are mean to women? It's not about men or women. And, remember, all genders are impacted by patriarchy. Patriarchy is this force that in our society orders how we think of things. And it's not just that men are superior to women, it's actually that a set of men within men are superior. So this idea of the strong, tall, good-looking guy is the best, that's patriarchy. The idea that a young boy shouldn't dance ballet because that's feminine, that's patriarchy. So patriarchy isn't just men against women. It's this idea within structures that there is a hierarchy between genders and also within genders. So with that in mind, this patriarchal system has impacted how women are treated, right? Less than men. They get paid less than men, but then also how they are treated in terms of their standing. And so women in patriarchal systems often have very defined roles. Their role is to be in relationship to men. So a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a matriarch is somebody who is the mother of generations. And so the other thing that women can be, so those are all within like reproduction, right? Wife, mother, blah, blah. The other thing that women can be in patriarchal systems is a sexual object, right? So this is this idea that women are either Eve or Mary. And very often they are either or, right? I do know where babies come from, but if you look at depictions of mothers, they're meant to be basically they're taking one for the team. They'll do this because they want to have kids. Whereas those women are loose, right? Like that there's this sort of duality between femininity. And this goes back to the male gaze for a very important reason. In visual culture, what you see is very often women are depicted as the ideal woman. So if you see in Renaissance portraits, for example, she is seen as very, gentle, eyes down, beautiful, all the things a good wife would have. Or she is seen completely as nude, sexual being on a platter, in this case, a bed, for a man. And these two images were created around the same time in the 1530s. So this is a good girl and this is a bad girl. And women can only be one of these two things. Nothing else. And this kind of objectification of women, and they're both objects, right? They're both objects to men. And that's what she was sort of getting at, Laura Mulvey, with her writing, that they're in service of men. And so you see that, and this is Venus, so she's not even a human woman, and she's in service of men. And this is a woman who's just a wife. And so then you get to, that continues, right? And that kind of objectification of women really continues for generations. But then you get to the point where in the 19th century, society starts shifting. And one of the major shifts is actually industrialization. Industrialization and capitalism is, often the bad guy in a lot of stories of history. But in terms of women's liberation, on some level, it is also positive. Women can do wage labor, right? So they can earn a living. They can't necessarily have a bank account, but they can earn a living. Women have more structure in their lives. Their husbands are home more. Not that they're yet doing much in the house, but, they also have more mechanized ways to do their labor. They don't have to cook all day long. So a lot of things are changing for women in the 1800s. And then one of the other changes is women can find work, including sex work. Because in the 1800s, sex work was a viable and somewhat legal thing to do in many places. And so you have this image by Manet, which takes what the previous image 300 years earlier, where Venus is sort of on a platter. Here, Olympia is also in the same position, but she's looking at you. She's saying, yep, I make my money. I do it and I can. And so while Manet's Olympia shows a change in society in terms of how women are depicted, it isn't actually a woman doing it, right? It's a man framing Olympia. And her job is literally to service men. So she's basically owning the fact that she's objectified by men. Now, it's a movement forward, but it's certainly not the female gaze. So then it takes us to the question, because this is around the time that you start seeing more and more female artists, because that part of this about the female gaze and the male gaze is that for most of history, most of the artists were men. So then what does the female gaze exist? And this is where scholars can't agree. And I have to say, I don't know. But like by the turn of the century, certainly you have women who are making a living at art, photographers, painters, etc. They are often depicting nudes. The way they depict nudes is wholly different than men. They depict them oftentimes much less sexualized, definitely much more realistic. They have love handles, they have imperfections, all of those kinds of things. And many of the women who are depicting nude women are straight women, so they don't have a sexual relationship with that person. So you take that element out of it. So I think those are all true. And then you have women who are depicting women sexually, lesbians who are depicting women, they're certainly attracted to them. So that would certainly qualify. But what a lot of scholars also say, and I think this is also true, is that all of our patriarchy still exists. So as women are changing how we are depicted, that is very powerful, but it's within the framework of patriarchy. And so for some scholars, the perception is that what we call the female gaze is really women doing the male gaze. And sometimes I see this. I see this, for example, in, like in this artist, she's trying to subvert the male gaze, and what she's really just creating is very sexualized deer and animals. And, it's actually hypersexualized. A lot of women who deal with art of the male, trying to do the female gaze, really just replicate the male gaze. They just replicate the objectification and sexualization of women. And I think that when I really think about who's doing what I would perceive as the female gaze, is people who are depicting women as authentic beings. But then, of course, by saying that, part of being an authentic being is being a sexual being. Do you see how this gets muddy? And so I think this is sort of an open question. Are we basically negotiating the female gaze right now? Are we in the middle of it? I would say yes. And I don't know which artists are the female gaze and which ones are basically women doing the male gaze.